It's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of Global Studies Program, Center for Study of Social Systems. This is the third and final lecture in the annual lecture series. And we are very happy to have with us Professor Silke Schicktanz. She's from University Medical Center Gottingen. She has a very interesting training in philosophy and biology, and she works, as this notice says, she works at the University Medical Center Gottingen, where you see people working on bioethics are often located within the biomedical faculties, and she works in close connection with the biomedical faculties, and she's going to talk to us. She's going to share with us her work and her views on this whole phenomenon of medicalization of dying, cultural considerations on end-of-life decisions in Europe and its global consequences. This increasingly we see that birth and death are no longer simple, ordinary events of life, but they have become highly technologized and medicalized. Very often what constitutes birth itself has changed with the advent of incubators, fetal surgeries, of surrogacy, whole new technologies of reproduction. Similarly, the notion of death, definition of death has changed with the advent of ventilators. So you could have somebody who is brain dead but not dead. So these are things which are of great interest to sociologists because very basic phenomenon of life are getting redefined due to technological and biomedical interventions. So we'll hear more about this aspect of medicalization of dying from Silke.
Yeah, thank you so much. Does it work?
Yes, you have to switch it on.
Now it works. Okay. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and also just the opportunity for inviting me and giving me this great pleasure to share some of my own research and ongoing, I would say, preliminary considerations in a field which is pretty challenging for most of us, given the fact that I think issues of death, I mean, that makes us all, so to say, symmetrical in the sense that we all have to face death, and it's, and almost to my understanding, and each culture has its own way to deal with death and at the borders between taboo and making it public, and so it's something which I think is very fascinating and challenging for researchers. I'd like to start. I'd like to start with sharing some kind of experience. I call it experience because it has something to do with my own experience, having first encounters with issues of what we label as end-of-life decisions. In Germany, we have an increasing, still you can say it's not that everyone has, but an increasing tendency that people compose what we would label advanced directives or living wills, which is a document or piece of paper you write down what's your imagination of a good death in a society where you expect that the medical system will take over. So I will say in a few slides later a little bit more around that, but it's an increasing topic, and it's very much in the public discourse. Additionally, it's also very important to have at least the fact in mind that in Germany almost 80% of all people dying not at home, but they are dying in the hospitals, in ICUs, or in nursing homes. So they are already in particular institutions. And this has, of course, also a lot of implications, the way how families and individuals have to deal with the issue of dying, and who should decide on what kind of particular actions have to take place. I'm just saying this, my personal experience, because with my own grandmother, I had a lot of issues, so to say, with medical doctors. When my mom and we had to decide whether we reject the opportunity of artificial tube feeding for my grandma at the age of 99, because we found a piece of paper which looked a little bit like this, very handwritten, not professionalized, but we never talked with my grandma in advance, but we were then founding this piece of paper where she said, I don't want to die having all these tubes stuck in my body. And then we went to the doctors and said we would try to follow the wish of my grandma, and they were accusing us of that we are responsible, that my grandma will die out of starving, and it was a lot of emotional burden for us to stick to our decision. So let me say a few words also about my research motivation to give you a broader picture. I'm in general very much interested in the dynamics, that's the way how I would frame it, the dynamics between the biomedical system, individual decisions, social-political norms, and what I often understood as a rather implicit form of cultural factors that play in all these levels of decision-making. Being a bioethicist, as you nicely explained, is something which is perhaps a little bit different than being a medical sociologist. So bioethics has its own tradition, its own history, its disciplinary history, and it's a little bit perhaps like theories in sociology. It's very much dominated by experts, I would phrase it. So it's in itself a discipline that tries to elaborate and also function as an expertise, especially at the intersection between academia and the public and political discourse. And I myself see this as a challenge to my own field, and I try at least to go beyond this expert perspective on ethical issues by bringing in laypersons and patient perspectives, because we think this is very important to understand the everyday issues of ethical problems, and not just the super layered or of an academic discourse. Second, I will not go too much into detail for this discussion, but I think it's very important that we understand that the issues of end of life and dying can benefit at least from framing them in a broader perspective of aging societies, or discourse around aging societies and how dying and aging are related to each other. Though we have several projects where we not just focus on end of life very closely, but we try also to compare it with other practices such as anti-aging discourses, and to see how this whole understanding of dying and aging have a mutual relationship. It's also the case why I think aging and dying is very well investigated within medical sociology. Bioethicists have really focused on the biomedicalization of aging as such. There's a huge debate, and I will try a little bit to capture it, around dying, but the broader field, the whole way how we try to biomedicalize the whole life course. This is, I think, something which at least had not yet gained sufficient awareness. So that's also kind of my aim a little bit to draw the focus in this field. As an ethicist, my major focus in research is to elaborate, to develop ethical considerations by describing problems in an appropriate way, but also to develop, of course, perhaps solutions, at least pathways to solutions in a more ethical, political framework. But another point, and that's where I perhaps here, is because I have a very close research collaboration to social scientists, is that there is a tendency in ethics and philosophy to be mainly detached, so to say, from reality, which means that there is a need to have a critical assessment of what I would call the empirical premises often made by philosophers. A lot of abstract theories are based on public things like that or this, but they never really concern what socio-empirical research reveals. And this is something which I think we have to take. Oh, yeah, that just came. So the outline of my talk will be that I want to say a few things and shape a little bit the way how ethical dilemmas around end-of-life issues are discussed in Europe, in particular in Germany, but I think the picture I'm presenting might also fit to the US. Then I want to present some socio-empirical insights in this discussion, part of my own research, and also present some other research that cover a little bit the picture of Europe. And then I want to reconsider what I would say the theory of medicalization. And I hope I open this for discussion by also raising some general considerations about what this has, or what could be the global implications if we, so to say, broaden our scope. So the ethics of dying, I mean, this is perhaps not a really new question if you consider that already in the Oath of Hippocrates and also in the Enlightenment, philosophers like David Hume have intensively discussed the issue of suicide and what's the role of doctors in helping people committing suicide. Still, I think it's interesting that somehow it's still a dilemma. So we can say it's not consensually solved. And this results in the fact that if we look around in different legal and public solutions, we can find at least 3 different kinds of solutions. So the first version I would call it the state paternalism. Is the table? Yeah. Okay. It's a state paternalism, in which sense I would understand any kind of legal framework that restricts very much citizens' opportunities to decide over their own way of dying within a medical system. They restrict the opportunities to have advanced directive. They restrict the opportunities of active and or passive euthanasia. Another category which we can observe also in reality is what I would label expert paternalism. This is often, for example, I think an example is the way how it is regulated in the Netherlands. Because, I mean, of course we have an overall broad state regulation, but then all decisions, so to say, are left to expert committees. So it gives a lot of power to the medical profession, at least to decide what kind of decision should be taken. And then we have a third kind of solution, that's what I would call the choice liberalism. So in the choice liberalism, the idea is to have a more permissive framework of patients' rights, but then we still have a lot of unsolved questions. So are these patients' rights just negative rights in the sense that the state or experts have no right to interfere, or are these also positive rights in the sense that state and the medical system or social system has to provide any kind of opportunities to give citizens really the broad range of choices. So the ethics of dying, at least in the more recent discourse in the 20th century, do, according to my understanding, somehow react to something that was already diagnosed in the 1970s. And that's the process of medicalization of death. And I'd like to draw your attention, perhaps some of you might aware of his work, Ivan Illich. He was a very famous German social historian and also, I think, a philosopher, you can say. He wrote in his book in Nemesis in 1974, the whole book was somehow the history of the medicalization of death since the 15th century to the mid of the 20th century. And I add the word European to the history because he has a tendency, to my understanding, to universalize very much his own theories, but still, I mean, at least the studies he were doing were focusing on Europe. So I think the European history of natural death is, according to his understanding, the history of medicalization of the struggle against death. And he points to, I mean, a very wonderful image, just to image this struggle, is this painting you hopefully can see a little bit with this doctor. It's from a very famous German doctoral introduction book in the 1910s, where you see this doctor fighting the symbol of death, so to say. And you can say it's really, so to say, the iconography, which is very important for this time, and also for supporting, of course, Illich's hypothesis, because medicalization to Illich has, of course, it's not just a descriptive theory he's offering us. To my understanding, his theory is, of course, also normative, in the sense that he is criticizing this process, in the sense that he wants to point to the problem because of the medicalization. It takes away, so to say, the opportunity of the individual, of families, to deal with the death in their own way, traditional way, religious ways, family negotiation ways, and that's something which, at least to Illich, is an issue. However, it's interesting at least to see that at the same time he was pointing or developing, as some of his fellow colleagues, this whole idea of medicalization, we can even in practice observe alternative movements. And you might have heard of the Swiss doctor and psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. So she is together with the British Cecil Saunders, you can say really the early founders. These two women are really the very most important founders of an alternative path within the medical system to deal with dying, and that's the hospice and palliative care movement. And Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, she also did she brought a new picture of the dying and dealing with death by, as you see, she's doing a lot of interviews with dying patients. And it's not about struggle with death, it's rather about, so her approach at least is about embracing the death again. So I think it's interesting if we frame and see how it's not only a theoretical criticism that appears, but also in reality we can observe that there are alternative ways that can be understood as a kind of counter movement to a very particular form of medicalization. What is the malaise of medicalization? I mean, Peter Conrad once said, I am not judging medicalization, it's just a descriptive paradigm. And there are the pros and cons of medicalization. Still, I think, to my understanding, there is a kind of malaise most of us might have with the understanding of medicalization. And it's not only that it gives a lot of power into the hands of the medical profession, but it's also that with medicalization there are other norms that approach us in the sense like it's I think the norm of activation and productivity, which are related to particular forms of medicalization, and as Sharon Kaufman put it, is aging and dying or any kind things are getting not a fact or something we have just to face, but they are problems. They are framed as problems, and now there is a way medicine has to deal it in a kind of project. So that we have to make a plan, we have to make, we need institutions to conduct these projects. So I think that's a kind of malaise related to the medicalization. Oh, thank you. So what I want to try to do now is, from this broader theoretical framework, to give you some insights, some empirical insights in the way how this medicalization might take place in the social practice, in the medical practice, especially given the fact that we already have a hint, at least because of the different legal frameworks, that there might be also differences in the practice in Europe. And we have to keep in mind that end-of-life decision, I'm talking about, is kind of an umbrella term for a broad spectrum of actions. And so, of course, the first of all is like any kind of treatments that are related to life prolongation. You mentioned the ventilator, tube feeding, also, I mean, you can say forms of dialysis sometimes can be understood, and also any kind of breastfeeding. But then we have other issues like passive euthanasia, which means rather the other side, not life prolongation, but perhaps shortening life. That's the practice of withdrawing or withholding medical treatment. Then we have physician-assisted suicide, which means that doctors are providing a lethal dose, but still the patient pays to take it. Or we have even active euthanasia that includes any kind of practice where doctors, or you can say a third party, is applying finally the lethal dose. Then we have palliative care, already mentioned that, and hospice. So I tried to give you just a little bit quantitative insights of the two interesting studies published in the last 10 years, which did a kind of at least quantitative comparative research, how often or what kind of medical practice take place at the end of life. And for some of the, for a lot of people, there were some interesting, astonishing findings to see that Europe is not so homogeneous that a lot of people think, given the fact that in all the countries, more or less, the legal framework is similar. So what the first study I'm pointing to is the so-called URL study published, for example, in the Lancet paper, shows that the practice of passive euthanasia being legal in all the countries that were investigated shows huge differences in the way. So you see just here, so CH means Switzerland, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, and Italy. And you see, Switzerland and Italy are neighbor countries, and there's a huge difference how often passive euthanasia does happen in intensive care units. Other thing, it was hospitals that all they were investigating and did anonymous interviews with doctors. But it's also interesting to see the range, how it's so. The problem, to my understanding, with quantitative studies, they give us interesting insights, but they don't explain really why is that the fact, but still it's, I think, a very important, and this kind of observation is then, to my understanding, backed by another very important study, that's the ethical study, which did, was a prospective study in 17 European countries where they investigated over 4,000 deaths in ICU units, and were selecting the documentary and analyzing what happened to the different cases. And what they found is an interesting difference between different regions in Europe. So just to show, perhaps, can you read the numbers? Is that okay for you? So just to see that the withholding practice is almost similar in all European countries. However, the practice of withdrawing means like pulling the plug, switching off the machine, the ventilators, or the artificial tube. There's huge difference in the way how it's practiced in Southern Europe compared the way how often it is practiced in Central or even North Europe. And also with active euthanasia, this might explain that it's pretty, compared to the other countries, it's much more common in countries like in Central Europe, because here in this sample there's Switzerland and Belgium, both countries were allowing active euthanasia. And also if you compare now the practice of withdrawing with the fact how often brain death occurs or rescuing, it seems that this is somehow correlated in the sense that the more often ICUs or doctors are willing or at least going for rescuing and then having patients who might be brain dead, but leaving them on the ventilator, the less often they do withdrawing, and the other way around. So I think this shows us that there is a kind of cultural, deeply rooted behavioral factors that might explain much better than just pointing to the legal framework in each of the countries. And according to the authors of this study, they try to argue that it has something to do often with the religious background of the doctors and the patients. For example, that in Southern Europe, where there are more Catholic or Orthodox doctors, for them withdrawing is in itself morally more problematic than withholding or even rescuing. While in the Northern European and Central European countries, there was a pretty strong support of the doctors, Protestant doctors, but also Catholic doctors, for the concept of the self-determination of the patient. So what they found in the studies, there was an influence of the religious background of the doctors. However, it was not that religious was, so to say, overriding the regional factors. So that was an interesting interplay. So we are stepping in our in our own study by focusing more on not the question how often these things are happening, but rather to understand why they might happen, how they are related to the perspectives of the public discourse, and also the individual perspective of those who are affected of these decisions. So what I'm presenting now is part of an ongoing study. It's an ongoing study where I'm doing research with a very good friend, a medical sociologist. He's Aviad Raz, he's from Israel. And we decided to do a comparative study on the way how bioethical dilemmas around end of life, but also genetic testing or life planning are framed in both of our countries. And we're doing this by having a different stages and different discourses, so to say, we are interested in. So one layer we started with is what we would call the expert discourse. So we did first a thorough analysis on how major documents and expert statements are somehow framing often the official positions in both countries. Second, we did interview studies with representatives of patient organizations, and that is why we observed that patient organizations, which I use as a broad umbrella term here, have a very increasing role in the way how public discourses are framed, also in Germany and Israel. They are more and more involved in policy making processes, and of course they have still this kind of bottom-up approach, which I think is often neglected, at least in the German discourse. And finally, we conducted in the last 2 years, over 8 focus group discussions with laypersons and relatives of patients that died or were genetically affected by chronic disease. So we have an overall sample of 16 focus groups, but we just managed to do the transcripts and then to translate it, so I cannot present, unfortunately, today some insights because we have not done, this material is very huge, but hopefully I can the next time present something. So what are the underlying assumptions for us to do this juxtaposition, so to say, between Israel and Germany? I think first of all it's very important to see that they show a lot of similarities in the healthcare system. So both have more or less show a lot of similarities in the way how public healthcare is organized in Germany and Israel, particularly in the areas like end of life where we are interested in. The second thing is that there is a bunch of studies showing that Germany and Israel are having interesting opposite positions dealing with reproductive technologies and also all issues around begin of life, where Israel is often framed as very permissive, allowing any kind of artificial reproductive technologies, where Germany is framed or is rather restrictive. And so we thought, is this really particular true for any kind of dealing with medicine, or is this do we have to gain more sensitivity that often these stances are also framed by particular medical areas? And that's what at least we found a little bit, that in the field of end of life, the picture is rather reversed. So I think it's very important if we talk about restrictive or permissive state policies, we might have a closer look into different medical practice areas. And thirdly, I think what is also very important, which justifies a kind of particular comparison between Germany and Israel, is the fact of how I would call it the issue of historical responsibility. Germany and Israel have very particular discourses how to deal with the Holocaust and the Nazi period, each from its own historical perspective, of course. But what's really important for the medical ethical discourse is that in Germany there's at least no discussion that took place in the last 20 years evolving around euthanasia or eugenics, where historical references were not made to the euthanasia program. So I think for the self-understanding of the German discourse, the reference to the Holocaust, in particular to the Nazi period, is very important. And also, as you pointed in your paper, I think it's also important to see that it takes or has an important relevance, of course, for the Israeli state and political issues, the reference to the Holocaust and the survivors. So we were interested how does this play in, not on the political, but also on the everyday level. Does it play in, and if in which form? Oops. So I'm summarizing some findings, especially with regard to the expert discourse, which I think are at least interesting and give an interesting insight in the way how public discourses or expert discourses are sometimes framed. So in Germany, for example, so with regard to passive euthanasia, which is in Germany always understood as encompassing both withholding and withdrawing, it's interesting to see that the all expert committees and also the legal framework does understand or does itself have a consensus status on the fact that passive euthanasia, or how we frame it in Germany, because we try to avoid the term euthanasia because of the history. So letting die should be always in accordance to patients' wish, but it's an accepted and even morally favored medical practice, while Israel is, to my knowledge, the only country in the world now who has a legal distinction between withholding and withdrawing. And it refers in its statement to a mixture between medical, but particularly Jewish values, where they try to justify this distinction that, so to say, stopping a machine is a kind of active doing, while just withdrawing, stopping a machine is an active doing, while just withholding a treatment is morally less problematic. Second issue, which is interesting, is with regard to assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide. While there was a pretty strong consensus on its prohibition in the Israeli discourse, in the German discourse, there is still an ongoing dissent in the legal ethical sphere. Even if legally at the moment it is not allowed, we observe kind of an opening space that, for example, the German Chamber of Physicians in its statement last year has said we don't see it's a doctor's duty to do physician assisted suicide. It might even cannot be justified with the medical ethics of doctors, but we understand that sometimes physicians are in a situation where their conscience might not let them another opportunity. So to my understanding, this is like opening up a new space in the expert discourse, for perhaps opening up a space for letting in discussions about physician-assisted suicide. So what are these differences, how can these differences trace back? And it's, to my understanding, not what is often perhaps firstly assumed. It's just the idea that it's because there's a Jewish culture versus a Christian culture. I think this is not appropriate to frame the differences between Germany and Israel, but there are much more factors playing in it. First of all, of course, it's the way how you set priorities between different ethical values. So while in Israel there is at least the value of sanctity of life is set as one of the highest moral principles for the medical ethics, in Germany it's, in this discourse, it's the value of self-determination. While both discourses, so to say, do assume that at least there are always more values at stake and you have to balance them. A second issue, which I think is very important to understand, is the way how trust is put in different kind of expertise. So in Germany, also the legal or the expert discourse shows, to my understanding, that there's not so much trust in medical expertise or medical as the best expert community to decide, for example, conflicting cases. So if there's a conflict between a doctor and a family, the legal now requires that these cases have to be handed over to a family court. While in Israel, also acknowledging that these cases occur not so rarely, these cases have to be handed over to a medical expert committee, and the medical expert committee will decide over these cases. And the third issue, which is also interesting, is the way how both countries try to deal with the issue of advance directives, because advance directives are often seen as the tool to empower patients and to give patients at least an opportunity to express their own wishes for a case they cannot express anymore, they cannot communicate anymore. So while both countries are supporting the idea of advance directives, there is an interesting way how you do it actually. So in Germany, finally, now advance directives are binding for doctors, and the format you can choose to write down such a advance directive is pretty flexible. You can do it handwritten, you can write 10 pages, you can just write a half page, so it's not, for example, required that you have to go to a lawyer or to a medical doctor who's assigning that what you wrote is correct or whatever. While in Israel, also admitting that advance directives are seen as very important, the law finally came to the conclusion it can be just served as an orientation for doctors, but it's not binding. Plus that the format you have to fill in if you want to write down is very rigid. It's a very complex form offered by the Ministry of Health, which is for a lot of people, Israeli, I talked to, very complex to understand what you have to fill in and where you have to make a cross. And the Ministry of Health rejects at least, I think, half of all submitted formats of being not eligible and things like that. You see that? It's an interesting way how you can deal then in practice with these issues, even if on the surveys they both claim it should be, it's seen as valuable. So now another study I want to draw your attention to is where we did interviews with patient organization. And here I'm relying on the categorization of Phil Brown, where he made, to my understanding, very helpful distinctions between different kinds of what he called embodied health movements. So we were conducting interviews with patient organizations from different organizational point of focus, but also from different political point of focus. So we were interviewing members, at least, or representatives of what we would call constituency or patients' rights organizations, both in Israel and Germany. Then we were interviewing representatives of patient organizations, like more like disease support patient organizations. If you think like the Alzheimer's patient organization or Huntington or ALS, so very particular for particular diseases. And then we were interviewing representatives of what we call partner advocacy groups. Partner advocacy groups also claim that they speak for patients, like for example NGOs who are in the field of palliative care and hospice movement. But if you have a closer look, it's often led much more by professionals or nurses, but not so much by lay persons who are just in these movements. And so we did pairs of each of these patient organizations and asked them in these interviews, so we are interested in the way, how do you see your opportunity to, so are you active in biopolitical issues like end of life? And if so, how do you do this? Do you have particular statements developed within your organization with regard to end-of-life issues, to advanced directives, and active and passive euthanasia? And we also try to understand the way how they do this opinion forming within their patient organization. And what we found is that it was interesting that all these patient organizations in Israel and in Germany, they shared all more or less the opinion that advanced directives are very helpful to at least to reduce doctors or medical paternalism. However, there were of course concerns that they see it might not help in all kinds of situations. So it's good to have it, but it doesn't solve all problems. I think this is a very reasonable stance. Second, what they also were sharing more or less all together is that they did not make the distinction between withdrawing and withholding for their own position, except that Israeli patient organizations were pointing to the fact that some of their clients, like Jewish Orthodox patients, for them this distinction is important. But so in this sense, it's important to see that the Israeli patient organizations themselves as such did not follow the Israeli legal and academic distinction. Also, it's important to see that both partner advocacy groups who are in the field of the hospice movement, they were both very particular against physician-assisted suicide, while in Germany, all our patient organizations had a rather, I would say, laconic stance in the sense, well, you know, we are Germans, we cannot vote for physician-assisted suicide, but in brackets, we know that a lot of patients would like to have it. While in Israel there was much more pragmatic ambivalence, given that on the political level there was this consensus on not allowing or prohibiting assisted suicide. It was interesting that the patient organization had a lot of informal knowledge how doctors have a way to deal around with these issues in a more pragmatic way, so to say. But they see at the moment there's no way to fight publicly for physician-assisted suicide in Israel. So, to our understanding, what we found is that sometimes the organizational structure, or at least which the organizational structure also mirrors, so to say, the political aims and of these patient organizations, did, so to say, override this very the very distinction between what is the German and the Israel patient organization, but they often showed rather very similar approaches to the different questions. The only exceptions are perhaps disease-based patient organizations, which within their own patient organization was stressing that they have often difficulties to format a very particular stance to bioethical controversial issues, because they have often a history of rather giving support to patients and their families, even if they now want, so to say, to enter the political agenda. However, they try to fiddle around the fact that the very personal experience with issues like that are often so biographically framed that for a patient organization in these particular disease fields, it's very difficult to develop a homogeneous approach, which I think is also just a very important finding. So I'm coming to the almost last part of my talk, and then I want to rather formulate some preliminary considerations how we might deal with the issue of medicalization of dying. I think, to my understanding, this is perhaps also kind of, perhaps counter movement is too much, but I think we have to think of medicalization as rather a process in itself of ups and downs in different ways. And to my understanding, we see that dying is, compared to the 1970s, perhaps much more seen again and recognized as a social act. And it's not only a medicalized act in itself. What we also observe in the social practice, in the medical practice, that there's a kind of competition between different medical actors. So if I think about high-tech medicine on the one hand, like what's going on in ICUs on the one side, but then seeing what's going on in the palliative care and hospice movement, which are both within the medical system, at least in Germany, that's the fact. However, they try to be more and more partners, but still, of course, they're competing somehow in the way how they approach the concept of caring for the dying, and whether they still believe there's a struggle, and or whether they think we have to embrace death and then we also have to give it up. And thirdly, I think it's even more complicated because it's not only about medicalization what we observe here. What we observe within the field of end of life, at least, is also juridification of dying and an association. So there are different kind of reflexive turns, so to say, and also the increased opportunity that more bottom-up health movements are questioning and also supposing different approaches. I think is a very important development that's worth to have a closer look at. And fourth, I think that the practice of advanced directive is in itself a very interesting practice, which was to the time when Ivan Illich was talking about the medicalization of death, I think not in place at all, or I mean very rarely at least. While now I think we might have look on advanced directives, even given all the problematic they have, I understand them often as a kind of counteracting medicalization, because almost all documents I've seen related to patient living wills, they contain much more resistance in the sense I don't want to be attached to machines, please stop any kind of life prolongation. So what I'm observing is a kind of resistance or counteract, and I think this is interesting in itself, even if in practice there are of course other problems in the way how we deal then with these documents. This gives me also the opportunity to comment a little bit on the issue of natural death. I think there is I mean, you're all social scientists, so I don't have to go into the detail of how we still talk about the natural and cultural division, and is this really feasible? Still, I think it's interesting that in everyday life, people have this notion of naturalness, and there is this concept of a life course, which means that as long as no one else is interfering, sooner or later we will die, and that's for a lot of people like a picture of what is the natural death. However, it's interesting that this natural death is now sometimes composed as even a norm or an ideal. We should strive for the natural death. And is therefore the natural death really a good death? And that's something I have some doubts. I think this wish, at least, expresses in itself, from my understanding, a critique of medicalization, a critique of the artificiality and the technologization of processes like birth and death. And but it also holds implicitly the notion that nature is something which is always good and desirable, and I'm not sure whether this is true. And also, which is for me more psychological, but perhaps also a social explanation why we sometimes refer to nature or to natural concepts. I think they offer us a kind of compensation function of individual duties, and perhaps we have to take this as something which is in itself perhaps worse to think, but perhaps we can find alternative concepts. The problem is if we would rely on the concept of naturals, I think we would buy a lot of problems. The one is that if we think nature is good as such, so perhaps all natural processes should be protected. And then, I mean, you can ask what is a natural process and things like that. Second, I mean, there's a long tradition in philosophy to see that at least moral claims should not be built upon just a description of some kind of empirical fact. So that's the traditional understanding or classical understanding of the naturalistic fallacy. And of course, there's a lot of, I think, substantiated constructivist critique of this nature-culture distinction. So let me close with some consideration of how can perhaps these considerations and examinations help to think more in a global perspective. I think there's really an issue around health economy and how this plays into these questions. So first, I have to say it's interesting that it was in Europe that assuming that cutting healthcare costs does, or oh, I think I lost some words here, that cutting healthcare costs do play into the individual wishes of people or families to force someone for withdrawing or withholding treatments to save costs might be a fear, but it's, to my knowledge, not assumed at all, and there are not a lot of empirical evidence that it takes place. However, the problem is that there is not a lot of empirical research going on, so perhaps we don't even know. So we know that there are bedside rationing happening also in a lot of public healthcare systems in Germany. But so I think it's at least a risk we have to take in mind, but we also need much more empirical research on these issues. Second, I think it's very important the way how we frame alternative or other treatments like palliative care and hospice care. I think there's a kind of misunderstanding that palliative care and hospice care is much cheaper and costly, more effective than high-tech treatment. I think that's not true, because really good palliative care and hospice treatment at least needs a lot of stuff, because that's the point. You want to have a lot of social care, and you need good facilities. So in this sense, I think it would be a wrong way to frame it like this is a cheaper alternative and that's why we should go for that. And it's a fact that in many European countries, including Germany, palliative care and some kind of hospice work is not sufficiently covered by public health insurance, but they can manage to still offer a good service because they get a lot of private donations. I think what we really have to consider, and what really concerns me, is what do these discussions implicate to countries where healthcare costs are mainly out of pocket. So there are a few evidence, like a colleague of mine, Pilang Yang, did a study in South Korea showing that there were evidence of cases where family members, elderly parents for example, somehow were implicitly put under pressure by the family for voting for withdrawing or withholding treatment because it was just too expensive for the family to do any kind of treatment anymore. And as they were seen as old enough to die, so there was also this natural death argument somehow. So I think this is a risk which is really important. We have you need a much more thorough look on that. But on the other hand, what I also have a concern about is that in those areas where healthcare is mainly out of pocket, I think it's not only the risk that people will not get treatment because of cutting costs or cutting health costs, but there might be also an overtreatment and the risk of a lot of futile treatment at end of life, because these patients and their families are very vulnerable. And there is a risk that overtreatment is sometimes framed as this is the best quality treatment. We try to show you do everything. And so that's because this market logic can play on both sides, to my understanding. Finally, I tried to make my mind, because we were discussing in class already, the issue, isn't it kind of cynical to talk about end-of-life issues, given that in many countries, I mean, not even primary health care is sufficiently available for everyone. Yes and no, I would say. I think it's very important not to play off different groups of vulnerable patients. I think we have to keep this in mind. And the second considerations I try to make is around the issue of culture. So what is this cultural issue that's playing into our understanding of how we deal with this very complex hybrids between modernity, medicalization, but of course also the way how legal framework is so culturally rooted often. I think it's very important to understand that there's not a very homogeneous practice, even in Europe, even if that's perhaps sometimes the understanding, that there's a lot of heterogeneity and diversity in the way how we deal with these issues in end of life. And I think what offers us the opportunity, learning more about these diverse practices, also to see what are perhaps models, perhaps better practice, perhaps not best practice, but better practice, and also what are the pitfalls and mistakes of some approaches. It's pleased in Europe, it's very interesting also to keep in mind that we have a tendency of homogenization on the supranational level, given the EU, especially in healthcare, has more and more impact in the way how they try to frame also national legal frameworks, which is often, I think, politically neglected by national politicians, because of course it somehow undermines their own power. But we observe, of course, that this aim of homogenization contravenes distinct regional cultures. However, also personal experiences and the diversity we can observe on the everyday level seems to contravene the idea on the expert level, the legal ethical expert level, that also tries to homogenize, at least within the national setting. A consideration I have, which I think is just a research question, which is for me very important, is the role of NGOs and patient organizations in this field, because I think they might not only politically empower patients and their relatives, but they also, I see there much more an opportunity to raise concerns from bottom up, which have not yet gained, so to say, the political level within Europe. And they also, what we observe now is that a lot of patient organizations try to have international meetings and to have also joined European associations, which is, I think, at least a very interesting development. Finally, I might try to make a point by saying perhaps it's very difficult to ever reach a consensus on these very difficult questions, and perhaps we should not even strive for that. But it also has something to do, at least in my understanding, with the very way how secular minds, which is a little bit my mind, my own one, might have a problem to frame death as something that is achievable, that's something we can easily embrace, we can easily accept. So there is a kind of psychosocial limitation in the way how we can imagine our own death being still alive and not knowing what does it actually mean to us. Well, thank you so much. I'd like just to acknowledge my colleagues who are really helpful, and yeah, I'm looking forward for the discussion now. Thank you.
Several issues and she made an interesting observation in the beginning that sociology of health and medicine is also another expert view, it's a professional rival of biology. So bioethics positions itself against all expert views, in that it takes into account popular and lay person's understanding of ethics as postulated against expert views either of the biologists or the sociologists. And also what was interesting was how she, in this lecture, she sort of put forth this contrast between the legal, which is this understanding of death, the moral and the popular, by looking at different stakeholders. What law says about death, what would be the moral stand on how death should be administered, if at all it has to be, and how patients look at it, patients' organization look at it, and so on. and made this concluding statement that death is a social act. We are already familiar, many medieval kings built their tombs before their death and had given advance directives as to how their death should be handled. But in the context of medicalization and the hegemony of medical doctors, advance directives have a different kind of significance. So we open this floor to questions, and please feel free to raise questions, make observations and comments, or your own personal experience in this regard.
Thank you very much for your very stimulating talk. I just have a few queries. Number one, when we talk about advance directives, I think we also have to keep in mind whether death is natural or accidental, unnatural deaths that happen. And at what stage in your life are the advance directives given? At the age of 40 or at the age of 90? And what is the disease that you're suffering from? Are you actually in a position to make those advance directives? And you talk about state paternalism, expert paternalism, and the individual thing. But in a country like India, you have family paternalism, which is very important. And this whole issue which is linked with property. Death is not death in a vacuum. When people are owners of property, so there is a lot of foul play that can happen, and it is happening. So are you being coerced? That is one question that we need to look at. And secondly, when you talk about Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, alternative kind of a paradigm which has emerged in Europe. So my question would be, how are people actually trying to understand the whole process of death and dying philosophically? Not only religiously, but do they believe in a concept of reincarnation? Do they believe in a concept of karma? I mean, are you going to exhaust your suffering in this life by lingering your death, or are you actually thinking in terms of your future rebirths? So how are your decisions based on these philosophical notions? And what do you think has been the role of Dr. Ross in not banishing death in Europe? Thank you.
Yeah. However you like. Yeah. So that's what I'm making it.
I was just wondering in how far, especially in the interviews, like all these questions of near-death experiences and like sort of how people perceive sort of what happens with death or after death or around death, and how far that is likely to in your research.
Okay, so let me start. I think the whole issue of advanced directives in itself is, of course, the closer you get, it's getting more and more complicated. I think it's a very important point. In general, I think there is an understanding, at least now in Germany, to see advanced directives not as something that once you've composed it, you should not change it anymore. So it's in itself seen as a process. I skipped it because I think I was already talking a little bit too long, but I like to refer, I don't know whether you are aware of a book from the American author Philip Ross, and the title of this book is Everyman. It's a really wonderful piece of novel concerning with this perspective of dying, and also how his way he experienced through the medical system in the US. So there is a nice quote in his book where he says, the best thing of aging, on getting closer to death, is writing a will. I mean, he means not a living will, but in general I think it's a very nice, because you write a will and then you rewrite it and you rewrite it and you reconsider it, and I think this is, in a way, how he puts it ironically, I think it should be more seen as even a constructive way to understand the way how we deal with this document. I myself, I wrote several pieces on defending advanced directives, not as something which is a fixed document, but it's opening a process of self-reflection, and it also depends always on the person itself how far you want to go, so to say, the road. I think, and that's
are men doing it more or women? That was my other question.
Oh, yeah. So I just have a few numbers in Germany, but in Germany at least women do it more often than men. So that's interesting that you are asking that. I think what we observe, also the statistics, I said to you that the surveys show that at least a third of Germans have at the moment an advanced directive. The numbers are slightly increasing, but you're right. I mean, the numbers look different if you get more detailed information at the age of people. So the older people are getting, the more often they have an advanced directive. And for example, for chronic patients, like cancer patients, and they have, I mean, there's a very high frequency of holding an advanced directive. While of course, if I ask my medical students, they think it's a very good thing, but none of them has advanced directives. And then I say, oh, I don't know how many of you are doing riding a bike and then without a helmet, and you're doing all these risky sports, so perhaps you might think of it, and then they get a little bit, oops, okay. So perhaps you should even think about, as a younger person, once you're in this, I mean, in this logic, I mean, you can also think of cases where this might make sense. But I think it's very important to see the advanced directive in itself is not only something which is very selfish or narcissistically oriented, but it really can be also seen as a document that initiates a lot of family and very constructive communication. That's the way how I experienced in my own family, even if the initiation was very hard. I mean, it's not easy to talk with your parents on their wishes around death and their fears around. I mean, you're mainly talking about fears around death. Still, once we went through this whole process, I found it really like a kind of catesis, so to say. So on the other hand, I think it's very important to be more explicit that it should be in document seen as a will, as a living will. You should rewrite. Once you get concerns, you should free and about this. Second issue, what you mentioned is the family pattern. Oh yeah, that's very important. I didn't mention it here because I was rather, perhaps I was not clear enough, I was rather referring to state solutions. But you're right, family paternalism is also a very important issue even in my country, and a lot of concerns around the practice before advanced directives were so common was that legally in Germany it's that the family is the first person that's approached. If the patient cannot communicate anymore, it's the spouse or the children who are approached. And this is legally, I mean, you can say it's self-evident. However, there are now a lot of cases documented where the family had a different issue, something different was at stake. So they wanted to withdraw a treatment, while then perhaps someone else can, hey, listen, I'm not sure whether grandma wants to have this. And then now, when you're pulling out the whole story, there might be also issues of heritage and money and property. So that's also an issue why you might think that advanced directives can be a tool also to strengthen a person's wish within a family by giving families also guidance, but also a document which can be used then by family members who want to defend particular positions. I think because it's somehow not only undermining state paternalism or medical paternalism, but also family paternalism. That's true. But on the other hand, it also makes clear that in a lot of advanced directives, it's common also to name someone who should speak on behalf of you, like a legal guard, in cases you cannot decide anymore. And here it's often interesting to see that discussions around advanced directives can explore different relations within a family, that there might be family members who trust more than others. And this, of course, opens up a whole kind of worms with regard to family issues. I mean, that's no protection in itself, I agree. Your second question was Kübler-Ross. I mean, just to put it very bluntly, I mean, there's of course a lot of philosophical approaches to death, also in Germany, but I think Kübler-Ross, to my understanding at least, can be seen still in a secular liberal framework, in the way how she was also not judging people. I think sometimes, I mean, often her approach is now criticized because it's very strict, and she has developed these stages. But however, in a more general perspective, I think what she was really increasing a kind of awareness that the ways how you want to die and what's important is really so individual. So we have to respect those who have religious and those who have non-religious views on how to deal with death. And I mean, Kübler-Ross herself, she was finally on a very spiritual path in her last period of career. However, I think in the German discourse, at least in the secular philosophical discourse, there is the main understanding of death. There is nothing beyond death. So we only have this life, and that's why you have to deal with it. And that's what I meant with my final comment. I think this is also why, in itself, perhaps for the secular community, it's very challenging somehow to deal with death, because there's no alternative conception of there's any kind of life after death. So you have to face it, and you have to get at least a very laconic or ironic stance to the way how you deal with your own death, and the way that we are afraid to, and with the near-death experience, I mean, we didn't do interviews on near-death experience. But you're referring to Kübler-Ross?
No, I was just wondering if it was an issue, so that if you discuss the question of end of life and how far people's own conceptions of what that means to them.
So what we were discussing, and what I can just quickly summarize from our focus group discussion, which is also a different setting. As I said, focus groups is not like a biographical interview. So people were not talking about their own near-death experience, but many were, of course, talking about being near to someone dying. And that was on the one hand very, very, also very emotional. But I was really impressed by the way how open people were talking about this experience, and how much they raised a lot of, showed a lot of similarities in the way how people were approaching these issues. So it's rather interesting to say that I think the classical understanding that there's a taboo around talking dying is not true anymore, because people had often very freely to come to focus group discussions and started, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late because we had yesterday the funeral of my father, and he just died in the night, or things like that. And then you sit there and think, oh gosh, and then they start to talk, and they see even these interviews or discussions as an opportunity to share their experience. So I think there is a wish even to share this experience.
But the question of sort of what that means beyond the dominant religious frameworks, maybe, is sort of the cultural backdrop, that wasn't something that surfaces at all in any.
It's rather a rough observation. I had the feeling that a lot of people were still on a descriptive level, just a description of the process. There was
Is there a scientific description of the dying?
Yeah, I mean, the medical discipline has, of course, a definition, but it's very controversial. So depending on the area of disease, some have a definition between the last 6 weeks, then it's the last 8 days, and then the last 2 days. It depends very much on the discipline, and so there's not a universal definition of death, to my understanding, in medical science. That's how.
Whereas in Tibetan Buddhism, they say, even after the clinical death, at least you need 3 more days before your actual death happens.
Which fits a little bit into biological concepts of dying, because in biological concepts of dying, we know that still a lot of cells are growing, and that's why your nails are still getting longer. And so I think the Buddhistic is very full of wisdom, because they have already embraced all these kind of implicit biological knowledge.
Please pass on the mic. One and yes. So you can just hear me. So you're talking about
So you're talking about self-determination and these individual decisions which are involved, especially in Germany. I want to know, what about the children who are involved? What happens about them?
That's a good question.
I
Switch it on.
yeah, it's on. Further up.
Again.
Further up. Yeah, I just wanted to ask that you talked about naturalness as an alternative, and then you talked about the need for empirical research about palliative care, and then you talked about overtreatment. Then I was just wondering that how far this medicalization of dying is actually an attempt to separate the expert knowledge, because even by doing these empirical research, we are trying to make an alternative. I mean, from a sociological vantage point, for understanding the process of dying. So how far, I mean, are we separating one expert knowledge from the other form of expert knowledge? I mean, I just want a clarification.
When you deal with ethical issues on dying, don't you think that what dying means, what your own death means, and what death of some other loved person, it means different? Death of parent, or death of children, or siblings, or friends, or spouse, means something else from what your own death means. This one could have very different set of values or ethical understanding of what it means when it comes to yourself. You may refuse treatment, but you might think if it is your spouse or someone should get. That's one. Second, studies also show that medical doctors do not apply end-life treatments to themselves that they apply to patients. Studies throughout the world show something very interesting, that when they are treating terminal or major diseases, doctors do not take those treatments for themselves or their family members that they prescribe to patients. They make a distinction because they think for the patients they should provide a treatment if it is available, whether or not it is effective. But they may, using insiders' knowledge, not give that treatment to themselves. So how will you look at the self-other with regard to dying and in this context?
Could we enter on this?
You want to take questions and then answer?
Yeah.
Yes, we could pass the mic.
So, as for my understanding goes, I mean, death has always been associated ambivalently with as a status symbol in our society. Like, and how this medicalization kind of reinforces that, or taking a cue from ma'am, when we do not have an alternative cultural understanding of death, how is this medicalization a resort for the family to itself cope up with, like it's a symbol of how they care for the patient? That's one. Second, how do you understand the market dilemma? Like there's a medicalization, there's a market in life and death, and at the same time, then patients willing, to get the medical assistance are denied that in a large number in our country. So how would we take that as kind of euthanasia, which you hinted at? And thirdly, in your understanding, I guess we have a very implicit understanding of health itself, where psychological health is not being hinted at, or that's not actually where you have all these questions. So how do you answer that?
I didn't get the last part.
I mean, it's not about your psychological health, where health, you're meaning something very tangible. So how do you handle that?
You mentioned in your entire paper the point that you want to look at death as a kind of a social category. I was just wondering, would you like to throw some light on the kind of people who were part of the survey that you did? Because I do think that, like, depending on whom you're talking to in these societies, you get very different narratives of what is death and how they deal with death. That's one. And then building on that argument, I was just wondering that, like, if you look at the situation of, in general, of people who are vulnerable, if you think of a population that is vulnerable, and I think both in Germany and Israel there are enough what we call sections of society to point out the phenomenon of vulnerability. Whether they are looking at Germany's kind of migrant population, you're looking at their kind of what we call the Muslim population there, you're looking in Israel at basically those who are considered kind of non-Israelis but living in Israel,
yeah.
The second-class citizens of Israel, whatever. So I mean, in both these societies, quite clearly there are fairly large sections of vulnerable populations whom it is just my, I'm just wagering a guess that, like, I'm sure for them there is another narrative of this thing you're talking about.
Can you
it appears to me that the people you're looking at, and I'm sorry if I'm wrong on that point, but it appears to me that the people you're looking at are people who are embedded in a discourse of what we call medicalization that is both rooted in a state-centric understanding of health, as well as rooted in an understanding that I as a citizen, I as a person of this society have a right to this thing. I'm a wage earner, I can earn, I have the money to kind of buy my kind of, it's this type of people. Whereas I do think that in societies where the population, where there are significant sections of people who are vulnerable, if for example the state wouldn't even want to consider that. The state might even think that you're not part of this discourse at all, right? And as far as kind of rights are concerned, they begin with the idea that because they are vulnerable, they don't have any rights of the kind that others have. They're like the groups that one would call excluded. I think that's not a proper word to use, but I'd still say that that's the sentiment that one could kind of draw around such groups. So how do they kind of experience this kind of a thing that we're talking about?
Thank you. Yeah, very important question. Okay, so yeah, thank you.
So let me start with the issue, and perhaps this fits a little bit in also your question of mental disease. So patients who are not. So you asked a question about children. No, you were the question. No, I think children and, for example, patients with mental disease might share overall the question, or share we might raise questions: how far are they competent, so to say, to make own decisions, or to claim, or to write down, or to communicate their own decisions. And to my knowledge in Germany is that there's
there are no advance directives at all for children, so you have to be over 18 and below 18. It's all of your parents have the right and the duty, so to say, to decide. So there is no discourse around children. However, we know that, for example, in palliative care for children with cancer, which are existing, there are cases where the children reject particular treatment after a while, and there is now an ongoing sensitivity, but it's a very open and very crucial issue which is not well investigated, and a lot of ethical issues are still unsolved around this. I agree with that. And I think there are a lot of similarities also with patients who are mentally ill or at least impaired, but on the other hand, there are a lot of opportunities now development within the psychiatry where you can show that it needs more time and perhaps efforts to talk with patients who have a mental disease, but they also are often still possible to form and communicate. So it's not that they are not able at all to communicate and to express their wishes. So I think there are a lot of more concerns with people who seem to be incompetent, but again I think there is this risk to make very clear-cut categories, like mental ill patients or mentally ill patients or children are not able at all. And I think this is in itself a very paternalistic approach to the problem. But on the other hand, you might feel that it should be not the way that any kind of wish they express that should be strictly followed. So perhaps we need a more procedural approach. But what I said before, I think this is not only true for children or also mentally ill patients, but also for any kind of patient, because I think these questions are not so easy that you can just deal with them by making one statement and then we should stick to it in a very, like it's written in stone. The issue of, I was wondering whether I got your question right. So I understood it like whether the issue of palliative care and hospice is just replacing one expert knowledge by another kind of expert knowledge. Is that your one? Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's still interesting that we need a more, that's why I suggest we need a more thorough picture, a more detailed, differentiated picture of what medicalization means, because there are different kinds of medicalization. And I agree that also even hospice care, who has the approach, and what I've learned at least from them, a much more holistic approach than the caring or what happens in ICUs. I still say there is a kind of medicalization, but it's not a classic. It's not. I mean, I'm not sure whether the term medicalization is. I think it's an institutionalization. What's going on? But it's yeah. But I think you're right, and that's why it's also worth to get a better understanding what's going on in the hospice, also in how it's distinguished. But it's also interesting to see that we often observe, at least in my university clinics, that there's still this kind of work division between the medical faculty, and then once they feel that they cannot care anymore for patients, or they have to give up the patient, as they would frame it, they bring the patient into the hospice if the patient wants to do this. So there is a kind of close relationship, and they somehow feed into each other. Yeah, I think the self and the other is a very crucial question. For myself, I think what you said, I think I can just subscribe everything. I think we have to be aware it's a huge difference whether we think and talk and reflect upon our own image of death, or whether we experience the death. I mean, that's the point that I think already Kübler-Ross made find it in a very nicely point, that the death of a beloved person is socially much more, it's worse. It's I mean, often that's also the worst of those who are dying is not about their own death. It's about the suffering of the others. They are also embracing, and they are also suffering about what is empathic suffering, so to say. And I think we cannot dissolute that. On the other hand, I think to make the distinction in itself can be also problematic, because I think that a lot of images of dying, at least I have, are of course my family genealogy of dying. So I'm somehow relying, my personal images are often feed by the way how I learned that my members of my family were dying. So I think they play into my personal image of dying. So I'm not totally detached from these experiences the other had. But I mean, it's true. I mean, and that's why I think that communication around dying might be at least a way to solve some of the misunderstandings. But there's always a distinction between dying, thinking about our own death, and caring for someone who's dying. And there's a lot of conflicts, of course, that evolve around these different perspectives.
Whether this should be built into the study. The study assumes that our informant is the individual. But the whole point is it's a relational question.
No. This is, even in our interviews, at least in the focus group, this is an important issue. Then we are asking them. We also have people who work accompanying someone who was dying, and then we talk with them about their own wish today. So this is, of course, something which we also have different case studies in our focus groups discussions, where we ask them how they would deal on behalf of their own, and then how they would deal with on behalf of someone else. And there's a huge, again, diversity how people react, but what we observe at least is a kind of sensitivity that people have a lot of already built-in sensitization that the self and the other distinction is important. So the way how you describe the problem, a lot of people would describe the problem, which is at least interesting to see. What you said, death as a status symbol, that's very interesting. I mean, I would love to learn more how it is here seen as a status symbol. I think carrying around, or the carrying issue for a family, I think is also in Germany, is not a status symbol. I'm not sure whether this would be the appropriate framing, but it's true that it has a social meaning. And to be a good family means also you have to care for someone who is dying or chronically ill, and only bad families don't do that. So there is a kind of social status. But of course it has also something to do with perhaps the demographic and social situation in Germany, where only very few people still live in bigger family associated in the same city. So because of work migration within Germany, the situation is very rare that families are still in one city together. And I think perhaps it's less common, at least, that people might commute if parents are ill, but they will not move again. So I think this is also kind of perhaps a social change. We just observed how work and labor are playing into these issues of caring, because it changes the family structures in Germany. I mean, perhaps your question is very important, and I take it as a very important research question. I can just underline everything. So the social categories of our participants do indeed not explicitly, and I say in our focus group setting, we decided not additionally add, for example, immigrants explicitly. But what we do in our sampling is, for example, to make sure that we cover all kinds of socio-educational backgrounds, for example. It's not only students we have in our focus groups, if that's your worry. We have a lot of people from any kind of educational and socioeconomic backgrounds, and we also in particular for my research interest, also gender issues are very important. That's why we also have always put a lot of effort in having gender balance in samples. But it's true, I mean, that what you are mentioning, the issue of that there might be, what you said, like second-class citizens or very socially vulnerable groups. And for them, this whole issue of medicalization might be a totally estranged framing. I think that would be not true, for example, for the Turkish community in Germany, because they are, at least with regard to the public healthcare system, they are very well integrated, and there's not that they don't get access to public healthcare, and there are ongoing studies showing that within the Turkish immigrant community, there's an ongoing discussion about withdrawing and withholding and care with regard to, for example, if they are religious Muslims. So we show a lot of parallels, at least also on the ethical academical level, I would say. But they are, of course, like illegal immigrants in Germany, and for them, of course, this topic is not available in the sense that the medical care is not available, and I totally agree with that. But that was not the research question, it's just of our research setting, but I totally agree, and I think also with regard to Israel, this would be, of course, I think it's in almost every country we will find citizens or people living in the country who have not the status of the citizens, and by this not getting the same health care access. However, I think it's very important to see that in comparison perhaps between Germany and US, it's important to see that at least much more people get a lot of health care publicly funded than you would, for example, find it even in the US, because it's publicly funded and because at least healthcare service for chronic diseases and end of life, to my knowledge, are not denied because of you are in a health care insurance that's not covering this and that. You know what I mean?
I was just wondering whether you would link this up with, for example, an idea of, say, dignity, human dignity. I mean, when you think of vulnerability, like, I mean, where do you situate the idea of a dignified death? Because
so the dignified death, this is a term itself which is really culturally embedded in a very particular German discourse. And this is, of course, in the religious community, but it has now entered also other communities. So the dignified discourse, that was something which was like a label for hospice movement, for example. And the hospice movement itself in Germany is raised in a Christian context, because it was Christian hospitals and money donations from churches and communities who were financing the first hospice, and were nuns who were doing hospice care. So they were using the first time this term of dignity or dying with dignity. But now it's so spread around that a lot of people would use this term just as a label for a non-medicalized death, which is interesting given the fact that we can say that also hospice care is somehow just another kind of expert knowledge, and it's another kind of institutionalization. But I think it's a reaction against a particular form of medical expertise, I think it's. Does it explain?
Now, I was looking at it more from the standpoint of an economic argument. About how basically the idea kind of seems to in some very nuanced, subtle way, seem to be like that we can't afford it anymore, so you just let the person die. There's all sorts of strategies that come into play, but effectively it's that you just let the person die.
That's true. I mean, that's what we would call it. I mean, that's the term we are using is bedside rationing. So, and it's very transparent in the fact because it's the medical doctors who can have a very implicit way to make decisions. But it's interesting, they have to make it implicit because explicitly they are not allowed to do that. So, but yeah, implicit way to do this. But because it's very implicit and somehow it's a hidden strategy, to my understanding. But it's heavily criticized at the moment. There are several communities within the academic discussion, but also from the health movement, who are trying to criticize this kind of implicit rules and are claiming for more explicit procedural rules. But it's very difficult because it opens up that's the fear, new slippery slope of having a discourse on rationing healthcare. And so, you know what I mean?
Like if the person is a poor person, yeah, the argument would be made to the family that, like, I mean, you don't expect the chap to live, for forever, do you? I mean, he is going to die someday, isn't it? So it's like as if you prepare the family for the death of the person, knowing the fact that that's.
But this logic only works
right?
if you talk about health.
The same doctor will have another condition to another family which says that you can't do that. I mean, that's a legal choice you're making, and that's not a choice that you can make. That's to be made by doctors. So you admit the person in the hospital and we will take. You see, the same doctor is giving you two very different kind of narratives, two different kind of observations, depending upon whom he's talking to. Okay? If it's a family of the poor, he'll make this kind of an argument. We don't expect the chap to live forever, do you? And so the family kind of succumbs to that argument, saying, right, it is time to whatever. Okay? In the case of the other, it's like said that you admit the person in hospital because we are the ones who are going to, and then they go through the whole kind of thing what Sujata was talking about, the whole thing of test and this and that, and they put up a fairly fat bill to the person, saying that the person will die, no doubt.
But this whole I mean, I'm sure that's happening, but what I just still want to stress is that in a system where there is the fat bill, so to say, is always paid because it's a public health insurance system. So, I mean, there might be other concerns, there might be other stereotypes that the doctor does socially connect differently to patients, and he might frame the problem in different ways because he has emotional relationships or social relationships are different. But from a logic from the hospital, to my knowledge and what I know, there is no indication that, for example, patients who are in private public health insurance in Germany, that they get at least an end-of-life care much more. There is a lot of evidence that they have much more diagnostic tests are done in Germany for patients who have private healthcare insurance, and compared to those who are in the HMOs of the public HMOs. However, for particular treatments like end-of-life, I think that's not the case. But once we are going through that reform, that I would have the similar fears. I mean, I think, and that's what's happening in other countries. I think for the US, there is evidence that this is happening because of this. I'm sure.
So, thank you, Silke, and thank you all for your participation. Recording of this lecture and discussion is available at the DSA. Like, it will be soon made available. We've recorded this. I'm taking your permission post factum.
Okay.
Thank you.
I see. Thank you so much for coming and raising all these important questions. I'm very grateful. Thank you.